Welcome to Scottish Ballet. I'm Catherine Cassidy and I'm here today with Hope Muir to talk about the work of Christopher Bruce. Welcome, Hope. Can you start by telling us a little bit about your relationship with Chris Bruce, how you met him, how long you've known him? I know you've got a lot of experience, 25 years of working together.
I first encountered Christopher at London Festival Ballet when I was part of the school under the direction of Peter Schaufis. Christopher Bruce was the resident choreographer in the company at that time, and that's where he has created a lot of his most famous work. He then left the company, and we didn't have any contact for quite a number of years, but I stayed a dancer with English National Ballet as it is now. And then when he took over the directorship of Rambert Dance Company, I was excited at the prospect of working with him and sent a letter and went and did the audition and was fortunate enough to be one of the dancers that he chose to relaunch Rambert Dance Company in 1994.
Wow.
Under that direction, which he maintained for 10 years, I danced with him and performed in a lot of the famous works, including Swan Song, Rooster, Land, Sergeant Early's Dream, and he made a number of ballets on me, which was the most amazing thing to have someone of his caliber actually create on you.
Absolutely. And also it develops quite an intense relationship between the two of you when you're working so closely to develop the material in the studio together.
Absolutely, and Christopher very much works with the dancers that are in front of him. And of course, with a troupe of dancers in Rambert at that time, we were a tight-knit group of dancers with a variety of backgrounds and experience from all over the world. And he really put together a unique combination of skills and talents and personalities that gave the company such a great identity at that time. We also subsequently became, as you could call it, quite skilled in his work because he was there every day, and his work was consistently in the repertoire. So we were very knowledgeable in his style, in what he demanded, and we were very involved in creation.
Can you tell us a little bit about that specific style? Because I know that Chris comes from, his training was very varied. He did a whole wide range of styles. And so his style has got a particular flavour, a particular feeling. Can you tell us a little bit more about that particular Bruce style of movement vocabulary?
I think that the first thing he always talks about in his training is the Graham technique, Martha Graham, which gave him a really strong foundation. But in his work, he brings in every element of his experience as a performer, as well as a choreographer, as well as in life. There's tap dancing in Swan Song, for example. There's a lot of folk elements in a lot of his work. He talks about musical theatre that he performed in as well, and he brings a lot of that experience into all his work.
My choreographic language comes from the early training I had, particularly in Martha Graham technique, but I employ everything. My classical technique, tap dancing, acrobatics, social dancing, musicals. I worked in musicals, I worked in theatre, so I will incorporate any kind of theatrical or dance language that I require for the particular piece I'm making.
In the simple explanation, I would say that the use of the back and the fluidity of the movement in terms of falling from one movement into the next really gives an essence of his style. The back, especially the use of the back.
And you were telling me earlier that when you're learning his works to teach it onto the company, you can tell if you've got something wrong, if you've picked up a movement wrong, because you feel that the fluidity's gone slightly.
Like with any dancer that does a lot of one choreographer's work, you start to know, not necessarily when something's correct, but you definitely know when it doesn't feel right.
Like a second sense.
I think when any dancer works with a choreographer over an extended period of time and dances a lot of that choreographer's work, you become very used to the style, the movement, the dynamic of the movement, the musicality of the movement, and how it feels. So not necessarily do I know when everything's correct, but I do know when something feels incorrect. And I will always go back to the source, whether that be Christopher himself or whether it be notes I have, and could try and figure out why it doesn't feel right. Mm-hmm. And 9 times out of 10 it will be because something doesn't flow naturally into the next thing. His work is very, very organic, but it does have a sense of action reaction that if you move the body in a specific way, the next step should naturally fall out of it. And he always talks about falling into the hip, using the back. And the rhythm of those things and how he puts it together is very unique to him. But that's, yes, the style is something that I think is in all of us that worked with him for an extended period of time. It's something that we can feel quite naturally.
You feel it in your body itself, yes. Yeah.
And what keeps me going, even at this late age, is the magical moments in the studio, what we create together, the dancers and myself, the collaboration of all these elements, all these people pulling in the same direction, hopefully. Or maybe sometimes contradicting and you having to battle it out. It's not always smooth and easy, the journey to making a piece of dance. But I love those moments of what I call alchemy in the studio, working with the dancers. What comes from them, what does come from them, I often sort of weave into the fabric of the dance. So I never feel my ballets are mine alone. I feel they were made with my dancers, and there's something of the original dancers that made the roles in the first place. And then when I work with another cast, I allow myself to be influenced by a new group of dancers, and elements of their personalities or the way they move will seep into the work. So it's a little different every time. It's like if you take one of Shakespeare's plays, put a new cast on, different personalities, different voices, different phrases, it'll be a little different. But that's what is magical, working in the studio in those moments that are so transient. You know, as soon as the rehearsal is over, basically it doesn't exist anymore.
And tell me, how does that feel then, working with a very classically trained company like Scottish Ballet? How do they find that? How do they find that kind of sense of dynamic when they've been trained in quite a specific way to then maybe move in a little bit more of a contemporary trained way?
I think it's challenging because it does look easy, because it should look easy, because it's very natural movement, but it's very, very hard to accomplish, and it's very challenging. And I think that initial studio experience with Christopher is always a bit of a shock, and also how specific it is in terms of his demands on the dancers, on the musicality.
And the clarity of the movement.
It's very clean, and nothing extraneous should be there. There should be no affectation. It's very, very hard to achieve, which is why I think Christopher always likes to work with a company more than once, and to introduce maybe a smaller work first and work with the dancers and give them a taste of the style and of the demands of that style.
I think it's always useful to come back to a company a second, third time, because the dancers have had an opportunity to get used to your movement. So the second time it's always easier to approach the work. The first time with Shift, I think it was a bit of a shock. But it's only a short, fairly, not an easy work, but it's sort of, it employs their classical technique a lot. And they were able to really do it very well. I think this piece will be more challenging in some ways, in terms of the movement quality. But we have a head start because most of the dancers I'm working with have worked with me before, and already I see them falling into the shapes and the quality of movement that they know I like.
which is why here at Scottish Ballet we started with the acquisition of Shift, which was a work that Christopher created for Central School of Dance in London, and a gorgeous little gem of a work, and so many steps in it, and jam-packed, and it's a whole 3-act ballet in 9 minutes. It's the most fantastic work. And the dancers really ate up the experience, and he was impressed, I think, with the dancers here, and that allowed us to then bring him back when we acquired 10 Poems.
Can you tell us a little bit about 10 Poems specifically in relation to the dramaturgy involved in that, and the imagery and the different dynamic qualities used with the rhythm, etc., because it's quite a specific piece in that way, no music at all?
10 Poems was something that I had the privilege of watching him create in Germany on a company in Kiel. I was out there setting Rooster, and Christopher was creating 10 Poems on this company. A wonderful company of dancers that had stylistically a lot of contemporary experience, and Christopher, utilizing those dancers that were in front of him, created 10 Poems, which was this gorgeous, unusual work that he made to the poems of Dylan Thomas, as read by Richard Burton. And I think from what he said to me, his initial plan was to add music to it. But once he realized that the musicality and the phrasing of the poetry, and how he was able to translate that into his movement and his phrasing, it didn't require any extra music. So it became this beautiful, quiet work, but intensely musical without any music. It's quite extraordinary. Probably one of my favorite ones that I've worked on with him. And the company at Scottish Ballet here did it remarkably well. He was very pleased.
I see the boys of summer in their ruin lay the gold tidings barren, setting no store by harvest, freeze the soils.
10 Poems emerged because I went into my local music shop. It's called Raves from the Grave, and you can get anything there. And on the counter was this picture of a young Richard Burton. He was reciting Dylan Thomas poetry. And I bought it for nostalgic reasons, really. I wanted to hear his voice again. It's such a beautiful voice. And as soon as I started listening to the poems, what hit me first, before the meaning of the poetry, was the musicality, the phrasing, the rhythm of it. So my first idea was to use the sound of this voice as a kind of musical accompaniment to a dance. At first I thought I would incorporate music into the structure, but in the end it wasn't necessary. I didn't use any sound.
In 10 Poems specifically, he uses moments of imagery, but they're never on the words. Tell me a little bit about how that works and how that helps the audience to kind of absorb the feeling and the meaning in the poems.
Christopher has used a lot of imagery in all of his work, sometimes with the lyrics of a song, or perhaps just the story he wants to tell in the narrative. With 10 Poems, because there was no music and it was just the voice of Richard Burton, I think that the use of imagery became very important, but his strategy in using it was to not always do it on the poem with the words on the poem, not to be so literal. So sometimes in 10 Poems a word will be said and then you'll maybe see a fleeting image of what that word was. For example, moon, he uses a few times, but it's so subtle, and that's his genius, is that it's never literal and it's never on every word, and it just allows the audience a way into the work and makes them familiar and comfortable with his choreographic language, in my opinion.
In my craft or sullen art, exercised in a still night when only the moon rages and the lovers lie abed with all their griefs in their arms, I labour by singing light, not for ambition or bread or the strut and trade of charms or the ivory stages, but for the common wages of their most secret heart. Not for the proud man apart from the raging moon I write on these spindrift pages, nor for the towering dead with their nightingales and psalms, but for the lovers, their arms round the griefs of the ages, who pay no praise or wages, nor heed my craft or art.